Welcome to another episode of the Chiropractic Assistant Training. And again, this is to help support the chiropractic assistants to be more effective, efficient, and actually enjoy what they're doing even more. This topic today is a pretty big topic. We're actually going to go into how the chiropractic adjustment actually helps and affects the patient in several ways. So we're going to go into this right now. So let's go into a reminder. Remember, our bodies heal in three phases. There's the inflammation phase, the repair phase, and the remodel phase. Each phase, there should be a different therapeutic protocol. In other words, the therapies that are done, because there's different physiology that's going on. So again, what's the typical goal in the pain, in the inflammation phase? Well, it's to decrease pain, decrease inflammation, decrease muscle spasms, because muscle spasms are typically associated with pain, to help protect and control that area from further injury. And then some patients help to also start to decrease radiating pain. A lot of times patients can have tingling or numbness down into the arms and to their legs. So let's go into how chiropractic affects all of these. The chiropractic adjustment only, so we're not talking about any other therapy. So we're just going to do a direct comparison of the chiropractic adjustment as it relates to each of the different three phases of healing and what it can or can't do, okay? So the second phase, so that's the goal of the inflammation phase. Remember, the goal of the repair phase is to increase what's called active, passive, and joint motion. If you remember, active range of motion is what a patient can do on their own. It's like if I bent my elbow, that's active. Passive with overpressure is an external force can move it further, like that. And then if you move it further than that, that's called joint motion. So there's three different motions within each joint: the neck, the back, the fingers, everywhere, okay? So that's the goal here. And remember, the repair phase is when the body starts trying to repair itself. And what happens, there's a nerve portion to it, and then there's a scar tissue portion to it. So if you remember, there's when the body starts to heal after cells have been damaged. And again, this doesn't matter if it's 1 cell, 100 cells, 1,000 cells, or 1,000,000 cells. This is what happens every time, period, okay? So number one is there's an increase in the number of nerves, it's called regenerative nerves, that go into that area. So that's what happens. That's one physiological effect. Number two, the nerves that go in there are more sensitive. In other words, they fire quicker. Okay. Number three, the nerves can get trapped in the scar tissue, because the second part of the equation is, this is the scar tissue component. Our scar tissue is collagen. It's a protein. And so what happens is your body starts depositing scar tissue to try to heal itself. And that scar tissue is called type 3 scar tissue. So we have different types of scar tissue. This is called type 3. Now the reason it's important is because we were born with type 1. So the scar tissue that comes in is not the same. And partly of what's not the same, it's only 70% as strong. It's not as strong as the original type 1, and it's only 70% as elastic. Okay. So now this becomes very important relative to the chiropractic adjustment and how chiropractic affects all these categories. And then the third phase is the remodel phase. So if this is essentially what's happening to the patients when they injure themselves, there's a fall, an injury, a re-exacerbation. In other words, all these patients that come to us with back pain, neck pain, shoulder pain. Okay, so here we go. So how does the chiropractic, so let's walk through each one of these and go, well, how does the chiropractic adjustment help it or not help it, okay? So the goal here is to decrease the inflammation. Well, obviously, from the patient's perspective, they want to get out of pain as much as possible. So how does the chiropractic adjustment help to decrease pain? And by the way, research has shown that 1/3 of the patients feel immediate relief on the very first chiropractic adjustment, 1/3. So we have a pretty good statistic just from the very first treatment. So how does the chiropractic adjustment help decrease the pain signal? Well, What happens is the reasoning behind this is called the gate theory of pain. And what that means is essentially there's a pain signal. It's going up from the area that's injured, whether it's the neck, into the spinal cord, into the brain. Okay. And what happens is when there's an adjustment, chiropractic adjustment, it actually stimulates the sensory part of the joint. So the joints have all these cells around it and sensory cells. And what it does is it stimulates those cells and it sends a message through the nerve pathway up to the spinal cord. And what happens is at the spinal cord, it actually creates a block. It's like a nerve block is what happens. It's called the gateway. So in other words, a real simple way to think of it, if pain's coming through this direction from the injury into the spinal cord, into the brain, we give the adjustment over here to these sensory nerves that are surrounding the joint and tissue, and it sends a signal to block this pain signal. That's a real simple way, and it happens at the spinal cord tract. It's called the gate control theory of pain. Okay, so that's one way the chiropractic adjustment helps decrease pain. Now, when we are talking about pain, the pain could either be what's called type A or type C pain. So either it's like acute pain, in other words, somebody moves or does something and it causes pain, or it's chronic pain. It's like a dull, constant, regular pain, okay? So the gate theory of pain helps more with the acute firing, okay? So that's one way the chiropractic adjustment helps alleviate pain immediately, okay? Number two, how does the chiropractic adjustment decrease inflammation? Well, first of all, why do we care about inflammation? Well, inflammation is a source of pain. Now, it's important in the healing process. You have to have inflammation to go through these phases of healing. So it is important. But what happens is when cells are destroyed through any type of trauma, whether it's 1 cell, 2 cells, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, it alters the pH balance of the interstitial fluid. In other words, the fluid surrounding the cells. And there's a certain pH that can either become more acidic or more alkaline. And what happens is when those cells are destroyed, it alters the acidity and the alkalinity of the fluid. And the acidity levels of the fluid is a source of pain. This is why we want to help decrease and control inflammation as fast as possible, because it's also a source of pain. So how does the chiropractic adjustment help with the interstitial fluid? Well, what happens with that, it's like a mechanical pump is what happens. If you think of the tissue and the joints, and if you just move the tissue, what happens with moving the tissue, whether it's a chiropractic adjustment or even passive motion, the fluid starts dispersing, starts going into the venous system and dissipating. That's what happens. Matter of fact, you probably have experienced this in the past when you've hurt, like maybe you've hurt your hand or your wrist before, and if you just start moving it, well, one of the things that's happening when you move it is that's the gate theory. It's sending signals to help diminish and stop the pain signal. That's why it feels better a lot of times, like if you hit your hand and you move it. But also what happens is the passive motion, the motion helps to move the imbalance of that fluid. It helps to move it out of the area into the drainage system, the venous and the lymphatic system of the body. That's why a lot of times, and it's not just the chiropractic adjustment, but also passive motion. That's why a lot of times when patients are really acute and a lot of, they have a hard time moving, a lot of times I'll just start moving them a little bit. I'll move for them so they don't have to contract their muscles. And one of two of the main reasons I'm actually doing that is I'm starting to fire those joint sensations to create the gate theory block, but also I'm doing that as a mechanical pump to try to move that fluid, that inflammation fluid out of there, because that's a pain source. So that's the second way chiropractic helps. Now, the muscle spasms are typically a reaction. It's typically not the original source of pain. A lot of people say, oh, I got muscle pain. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as muscle pain. All pain is through the nervous system. So whether the pain is from a broken bone, damage to a muscle, damage to a tendon or a ligament, it's the nerves within that tissue that carry the sensory or the pain signal. But what happens with muscle is the muscle is typically a reflex spasm due to some pain. In other words, it's the body's way of trying to shut down that area to prevent further damage. So it's not directly in the muscle. So what happens is when we give the adjustment and we send that signal to help block the pain, that what we call the gate theory, well, it blocks this reflex, this muscle reflex. And so that's how it also helps to decrease the muscle spasms. That's how that works. Now, radiating pain can be from a pinched nerve, radiating pain, tingling or numbness down into the arm or to the leg. Now, how we help that is just literally when we adjust the spine. Now that is literally helping to relieve the pressure off the nerve that's causing pressure that's radiating down into the arm, tingling or numbness, or down into the leg. So that's how the chiropractic adjustment helps with radiating pain. And by the way, physical medicine is the only thing what we're talking about. We're talking about the chiropractic adjustment right here, physical medicine. Now, patients can do all kinds of things in this area. I mean, they can take medications. I mean, so they can take herbs and supplements. So there's all kinds of different therapies for pain. But this is how chiropractic specifically, and of course the benefit with chiropractic is there's no side effects. That's all natural. And so a lot of times in my office, I would use a combination. I would use the chiropractic adjustment to help decrease pain, inflammation, and muscle spasms. I would use therapies like muscle stim is also good to help decrease pain or muscle spasm. And I'd use anti-inflammatory supplements. See, so I kind of used all three, not just the chiropractic adjustment. But we're just talking about the chiropractic adjustment and how it affects each of the three phases of healing. Okay, so let's go to the second phase, the repair phase. So remember, the therapy goal here is to try to get those injured joints back to full active range of motion, overpressure, and joint motion. Okay? Now the joint motion, that, you know, when a chiropractor is giving an adjustment, you hear that popping sound, that's joint motion. Okay? That is the most important part of all motion because it's the fulcrum. That's where all motion starts. In other words, if I was going to move my elbow, the movement's not starting out here. The movement's starting at the joint, the fulcrum right here. That's the most important part of all this motion. Active, passive, overpressure. It's the joint because it's the fulcrum. Excuse me. Okay, let's go into, we said in the repair phase, there's an increase in the number of nerves. So as a natural phenomenon, when there's injured tissue in the back or the neck, wherever, there's an increase in the number of nerves to that area. Now the bad news is if the patient heals wrong with an increased number of nerves in that area, when they move, they'll experience pain sooner than they had before just because there's more nerves in that area, so there's more chance of them getting compressed. And what we're going to be looking at is what's called compressive forces, compression, and tensile forces, pulling, compressing together and pulling. Because when we do that, it decreases the area. Well, if there's nerves in that area, they get compressed. So how does chiropractic help this if there's an increased number of nerves? Well, when you get the chiropractic adjustment, it helps to increase the volume of that area, the space. So it's not as tight. In other words, when we bend forward or backward or to the left or to the right, when we get to chiropractic adjustment and we increase the range of motion, there's not as much compressive forces or tensile forces. And when there's not as much compressive or tensile forces, that decreases the amount of compression on those nerves, which decreases the pain, which means the patient can do more and further without pain. That's how the chiropractic adjustment helps this. Now, number 2 here, it says increased nerve sensitivity. Well, when those nerves come in, those new regenerative nerves that come in there, they fire quicker. They're more sensitive. And you may have noticed that, like if you've injured your thumb or your hand, it doesn't take much to touch it before it hurts. Well, if those nerves heal wrong with increased sensitivity, what does that mean to the patient? Well, it means that they're going to, when they increase their compressive or tensile forces, they're going to feel it. In other words, they'll feel it quicker because their nerves are going to fire quicker. So how does chiropractic help that? Well, it's real simple and a good analogy of how in other words, the chiropractic adjustment helps to lower the sensitivity of the nerve firing. In other words, it resets the firing. A really simple example, again, is if let's say you injured your thumb, and this is your hand or whatever, and this has happened to most people somewhere in life. And you feel the pain. Well, if you just rubbed it, I'm not even talking about moving it, because if you move it, that's a different relief. That's the nerve block signal. But if you just rubbed it, you'll notice that it won't be as sensitive after you rub it for a little while. The sensitivity will decrease. And if you did that every day, the sensitivity get less and less and less. That's what happens. So when you get the chiropractic adjustment, that's how the chiropractic adjustment helps to reset the firing of those nerves to where it's lower. This is the importance of physical medicine, by the way. Chemical medicine or drugs can't do this. Number 3, the nerves get trapped. Well, what happens now when we say trapped in what? Well, they get trapped in the scar tissue. Now remember, anytime there's an injury to the cell, remember that scar tissue starts going in there. Well, it goes in there randomly like that. And so another source of potential pain with patients is if it heals randomly. Well, those peripheral nerves that are regenerating, they'll go in between that scar tissue. Now, the bad news is when the person moves, that scar tissue starts contracting and collapsing on itself. Well, if there's nerves in between that scar tissue, it starts to compress those nerves. And remember, there's typically an increase in the number of nerves, and those nerves are more sensitive. So what does that mean to the patient if they heal wrong like that? Well, once again, it means when they move, they'll start having pain. The more they move, the more pain they feel too. Eventually, they just stop moving in that one direction or multiple directions. So how does chiropractic help prevent this from happening? Well, when you get the adjustment, when you get a chiropractic adjustment, what happens to the tissue, our tissues grow essentially as a result of electrical impulses. That's like when we lift muscles or lift weights. When we lift weights, this is kinetic energy. We're moving. This energy, it fires the nerves, which fire the muscle, which tell the muscle to grow. In other words, tissue grows as a result of nerves firing, and whether it grows or retracts. Okay, so with bones, it's the same with bones. If you have abnormal pressure on bones, that sensation, that pressure turns into nerve impulses that tell the bone to grow, which causes abnormal growth. That's called Wolff's Law. That's why we see spurs with altered spinal biomechanics with patients. Well, with soft tissue, the same thing happens. So we're talking about the nerves that are getting trapped. What we're doing is when we adjust the patient, we're actually applying kinetic energy into what's called the line of drive. And the line of drive becomes very important. The line of drive is what are called the stress lines. These are the angles where most of the stress occurs. In other words, if you looked at 360 degrees, stress would not be equally 360 degrees around that joint. Some joints, it would be much more narrow in one direction or another. Okay? Now, that is a direct result of gravity, stress, physical medicine. So when we adjust a patient in the line of drive, during the repair phase of healing, in other words, as that collagen is forming, instead of the collagen being random like this, it starts to align in the line of stress that's being delivered. Well, that's the chiropractic adjustment within that joint. Now, when it aligns, it decreases the likelihood of those nerves getting trapped. Because if it doesn't, if it stays like this and then the person moves, it traps the nerves, causes pain. But if the fibers align, it decreases the likelihood of those nerves getting trapped. And by the way, what I just shared with you is the number one reason for failed back syndrome. 50% of back surgeries are considered failures. The number one reason why is after they do the surgery, the scar tissue comes in there, and then those peripheral nerves get trapped in the scar tissue. That's the number one reason for failed back surgery. So that's how chiropractor, that's the importance of physical medicine aligning the collagen as it's healing to decrease the likelihood of those nerves getting trapped. That's also why there needs to be regular adjustments. That's why you don't just do it once. In other words, you don't just go work out, lift weights one time and have huge biceps. No. There's got to be periodic and regular stimulation with that piezoelectric effect during the growth process, which will affect it. That's why the chiropractic adjustments are given 3 times a week, twice a week, something like that, especially in the beginning phases. That's why. Okay, so this is what happens. This is how the chiropractic adjustment helps the nerves. Let's go into the scar tissue now. Remember, we said 2 things happen. The scar tissue is only 70% as strong or 70% as elastic. Now, if it's only 70% as strong, in other words, remember, it's type 3 scar tissue. It's not type 1 like you were born with. So it's weak. It's naturally weaker. One of the reasons it's weaker is that it's going in randomly. That's one of the reasons. A really good example to show this. Now, the bad news, and I'll share with you an example, but the bad news is, again, if this heals this way, in other words, with the patient, if it heals randomly, that scar tissue heals randomly, it will re-injure quicker. In other words, the patient won't have to do as much before that scar tissue kind of starts breaking, okay? And how that works is if you kind of think of 10 pieces of thread, like sewing thread, and if you had 10 in a circle, they were all in different areas of the circle. Well, I could pull in 2 directions on one particular thread, and it wouldn't take much pulling to snap that thread. And think of the thread as a thread of scar tissue. It wouldn't take much to do that. That's why people re-injure themselves so easily when this heals wrong. So the goal of the physical medicine when we adjust the patient, it's like taking all of those threads, and remember we talked about the importance of what's called the line of drive, the stress lines. Because remember, the stress is not equally, it's kind of like my hip bone. There's a lot more strength in this direction with the bone than in this direction because there's not much pressure or force coming in horizontally. So it's much weaker. But it's real strong vertically because of gravity and weight. That's what's happened with the bone growth due to the electrical impulses. So what happens with the strength is when you get the chiropractic adjustment during the repair phase, instead of those collagen fibers being random like those threads, it's like taking each one of those threads and starting to align them all in the direction of what's called the line of stress. Well, now let's do the same thing. So let's say they line up. So now instead of all 10 threads going in all different directions, let's say all 10 of them are in one direction. Now let's apply the same force. Let's just pull. Let's do the same thing. Let's pull again. We wouldn't be able to snap those threads now. Now we easily could if it was just one. Matter of fact, it's significantly stronger now, not just a little. It would take a lot more force to pull before you'd snap all 10 of those, as opposed to one. That's the power of the alignment of the scar tissue. That's what happens when we give the adjustments. The physical medicine stimulates the growth of the cells in that particular line of direction. Well, that's the stress line that we need the growth to occur. It helps to align that collagen as it's being laid down. Why? Because of the piezoelectric effects. The mechanical energy stimulates the nerves to send an impulse to say, grow here. That's kind of a simple way of thinking about it. That's how we help decrease the weakness of that area. The second area, and by the way, that happens in the remodel phase. That's why in the remodel phase, we're trying to do therapies to increase the strength and the elasticity of the injured area. This is why right here. So here we're trying to increase the strength by doing resistance exercise, PNF, TheraBands. That's what that's about. We're trying to align that collagen scar tissue to decrease the likelihood of a permanent injury, number one, and number two, decrease the likelihood of reexacerbations. In other words, easily causing those micro lesions again. Okay, now, next category. It's only 70% is elastic. Okay, how does the chiropractic adjustment help that? Well, and again, this is in the remodel phase. So here, we're trying to increase the elasticity. Why? Because that new collagen that goes in there, remember, it's type 3. It's not type 1 like you're born with. So it's only 70% is elastic. Now, what does that mean if the patient heals that way wrong? In other words, they heal, but they heal with only 70% elasticity of that new scar tissue. What does it mean to the patient? They'll feel stiff, typically at the end range of motion. That's when they feel stiff. They can't do it. So to prevent that from happening, we're going to use physical medicine again. We're going to come over here. And this is where we'll use stretching exercises, such as reciprocal inhibition exercises, stretching exercises. So we're trying, this is when a really good example of the remodel phase is like wet cement going to dry cement. So we're trying to take this cement, this remodel phase of tissue, and we're trying to make it elastic before it dries and hardens and becomes permanent. That's what we're trying to do. That's a real, just easy way of thinking about it. So that's what physical medicine and chiropractic does to elasticity. So it'll help increase the elasticity. So again, it has to be applied with regularity. In other words, we can't just do something one time and it have 100% effect. By the way, this is also why a lot of times when patients come in and they get adjusted, they immediately feel they can move more. We see this with patients all the time, whether it's their back or neck. We'll adjust them and they'll go, oh, I feel like I can move more. Well, they can move more, okay? Because that's exactly what happens. So these are all the science-based physiological effects that are happening with the chiropractic adjustment relative to each of the three phases of healing and what is naturally going on in the body. Okay? So this is why typically in the inflammation phase, obviously we'll do chiropractic to help with that. But like I said, we can do some other anti-inflammatory things. But the bad news is a lot of times those have side effects. The chiropractic adjustment doesn't. This middle part right here, the repair phase, that's vital. That is the most important part to get physical medicine in. When that body starts healing with the nerves, increased nerve sensitivity, and they're getting trapped and increased nerves, that's where it is vital to get chiropractic adjustment. In other words, physical medicine in all three ranges of motion. Active range of motion, passive overpressure, and joint motion. All three. And out of all three of those, which one is the most impactful, has the greatest impact? Joint motion, the chiropractic adjustment. Why? Because it's the fulcrum. Everything starts at a fulcrum. That's why. That's why it's so important to have physical medicine, chiropractic adjustment during the repair phase of healing to affect those nerves. And then, of course, that takes us over to rehabilitation, to affect the strength and the elasticity. The difference between us versus a physical therapist will also try to increase strength and elasticity. The difference is they will only work in the active range of motion. They won't work in the active, passive, and joint motion. And remember, when you affect the joint motion, that's the fulcrum, so it affects everything, overpressure and active range of motion. So it affects all three, not just one. That's the difference in this category. of physical therapy versus chiropractic. So hopefully that was beneficial to help explain exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then we may use other modalities along the way to help with the pain or inflammation, or to help with the active, passive, or joint motion, or to help with the strength and elasticity. But that is very specifically what the chiropractic adjustment does relative to the science of the three phases of healing and how the body heals, and what we're trying to do to not only help the patient feel better, move better, but decrease the likelihood of a permanent injury with pain and restrictions, which ultimately create, if it heals wrong, it ultimately causes abnormal wear and tear on the joints as they move, and that is called osteoarthritis, and that's the #1 disability in the United States. 1 in 5 Americans have osteoarthritis. This is why they have it. When they had major or minor trauma, they did not receive physical medicine, chiropractic, in all 3 ranges of motion during the repair phase of healing. So hopefully that helps out explain a little bit about what we're doing. And I was only referring to the chiropractic adjustment only and how it affects each of the 3 phases of healing. So hopefully that helps you better understand what we're trying to do with our patients and help them. Okay? So we'll see you on the next episode of the Chiropractic Assistant Training.